Welcome to the Fundamental Health Podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Paul Saladino. This podcast is the result of my relentless search to understand and correct the roots of chronic disease and illness. In this podcast, I will share with you everything I have learned about how to live the most healthy and radical life possible. Thanks for joining me on this journey.
What is up, you guys? Welcome to the Fundamental Health Podcast. Another week in Africa. I am running around somewhere right now, hunting with the Hadza, hanging out with the Masai, hopefully making arrows in the bush and chasing down some food for dinner that we will respectfully harvest and then be a part of the natural world, be a part of the ecosystem. This is my immersion into the remembering, something I talk about so much. And guess what? The Hadza eat nose to tail. Do you eat nose to tail? Are you getting organs in your life? Are you reclaiming your ancestral birthrights, radical health? This is what we do at Heart and Soil. So if you need more organs, check us out there for desiccated organ supplements in convenient capsules, which are of course made from gelatin because we wouldn't use plants because that's made of veggies. Anyway, you get the idea. We have grass-fed, grass-finished organs of all sorts, all shapes and sizes. I took beef organs, gut and digestion, and histamine and immune with me to Africa. When I am back home in Austin, I also love lifeblood, heart of the warrior, so many good things. But right now, I'm excited about histamine and immune because of the thymus, which has TA1, which is helping with the immune system, tonicity. I talk about that in my newsletter, which you can subscribe to at heartandsoil.co, and also about Immunomilk. Because I'm hopefully going to get to drink some milk with the Masai, and we'll see how I react to that. But Immunomilk is colostrum. It's grass-fed, grass-finished colostrum full of peptides, growth factors, and immunoglobulins, which really help the immune system over time and help us all have a stronger immune response. Colostrum has even been studied and found to be as effective, if not more effective, than a flu vaccination for preventing the flu. So how cool is that? So in immune virus season, check out Histamine and Immune and Immunomilk in addition to everything else we make at heartandsoil.co. And this episode is an episode about the remembering. This is with my buddy Mansal Denton, who I went hunting with last year in the wilds of Texas. I got a deer with my bow, and Mansal takes you all out hunting. So it was really cool. He's actually a sponsor of this podcast, though this is not a sponsored episode, and he does sacred hunting. You can check him out at sacredhunting.com/Paul. As I say in the sponsor read for this episode for Mansal's Sacred Hunting, you can go hunting with him like I did. And it's really more than just tracking animals. It's actually understanding that there is a connection with the natural world. And Mansal does this so well in his hunts. And so I'm so happy to have been able to talk to him about this and to also support him through as a sponsor, or have him support the podcast and support him as he sponsors the podcast. So you guys, I think will really like this episode. It's less technical than usual, but we talk about his experiences hunting, the tribes he's hunted with all over the world, how they are eating nose to tail, how they appreciate the organs, and what it's like to spend time in the wilderness. This is what the remembering is all about, how our ancestors both ate and how they lived. And that's what I'm looking for right now in Africa. And that's what I talk about with Mansal in this episode. So enjoy this episode with Mansal. Mansal, welcome to the podcast, my friend. It's good to connect with you.
Absolutely, man. Good to do it in some kind of official capacity other than just hanging out at Barton Springs Pool.
You know, that's where we've usually hung out in the historical sense. When I was in Austin earlier this year for Paleo Effects, I guess you and I connected then, or even before that, I was in Austin and you and I connected, and we really resonated, or I really resonated with a lot of the things that you were doing. And so we had a lot of great conversations about hunting. One of the coolest things that you told me about when we first met was that you had undertaken this quest to eat all of the meat that was going into your body as things that you had hunted, which I thought was so cool because, you know, hunting is something that I've done a little bit of. I want to do more of. We are going to talk about something that we are creating together to allow people to do more of it. But this is something that's been a part of your life for so long, hunting and the connection with the gathering of animals. Tell me about this intention to get all of the meat that you're eating from things that you've hunted. Where did this come from?
Well, as with many strong commitments these days. It came from an ayahuasca experience,
Uh-huh.
and it came also from a desire to look at meat in a different light than just a restaurant or a store. And I think I definitely was feeling this desire to be a little bit more connected to it about 3 years ago. So it hasn't actually been a long experience for me. It's just been a very condensed and intense experience. But I felt disconnected from the meat, and that longing to do something about it kind of sent me on this path. And very soon after my first hunting experience, I kind of made this decision that it was going to be a practice for both my health, for the planet, in a conservation environmental perspective, and also from a spiritual perspective, that hunting was going to kind of be a practice. And it's a daily practice now. And like you said, it's something that I have real stakes when I go out into the field, because I'm not just providing food for fun or experiencing hunting for the fun of it, but I really am trying to fill the freezer for the full year, trying to get a lot of organ meats for the purposes of getting adequate nutrition and things like that, because it is rare to purchase those kinds of things. And so that's kind of the journey that I've been on lately.
I've talked about this a little bit, and every time I talk about it, I get kind of this emotional feeling, and I think like I need to talk about this more. When I was on the podcast with Tom Bilyeu, this came up a little bit, and it's not something that is really talked about much in ancestral and paleo communities or the carnivore community. But I agree with you completely. When I walk into the grocery store and buy meat, that is an incredibly fundamentally different experience than the one season that I hunted meat and then ate that animal. So many times I hear from plant-based advocates or vegans that eating meat is cruel. And I think, man, I want to take every single one of those vegans hunting and show them that it's not. That it can be a very spiritual practice. And it's probably, for me at least, and I think for you, one of the most fundamentally spiritually connected things that we can do and have been doing as humans for our entire evolution. And in some ways, I think that so many of us are just cheated out of this sacramental experience. I use that loosely, but we're cheated out of that sacramental experience by convenience of just going to a meat counter and buying meat, when I believe, and I think you agree with this, that for our ancestors, this was one of the central things that they did on a day-to-day basis, was interact with the natural world and understand that it was a give and take process, and that it was a cycle, and that in order for life to continue, something else had to die, and that it wasn't fundamentally cruel to kill something. It was part of life, and that intrinsic or built into that was a responsibility to live well, because the land, the earth, the environment was providing for us. Is that the way you think about it? Like, how do you sort of contrast buying meat at a meat counter and hunting it yourself, spiritually, emotionally? What's your experience?
Well, my experience has been such a mixed bag, and I am quite an emotional person, and so I agree with you that my hunting experiences there's not cruelty in the experience, because I have such a love for these animals and an admiration for them. And but I also experience a lot of sadness and grief, and there are periods when I have had intense experiences, holding down an animal and stabbing him in the heart while I'm looking it in the eyes, or when I see it writhing on the ground and I want to look away, but I force myself to actually watch the death happen. And that sadness, for a long time, I kind of disassociated from it, because like you said, hunting is so natural and it's such a great way of connecting to the practice. I didn't want the sadness to be a part of that experience. And what I realized was that is part of the gratitude that I have every meal that I eat. That's part of the connection that I feel to that animal. I have a bison skull on my fireplace right in front of me, and her name's Alice, and I name her and I have a relationship with her because it fundamentally changes not only how I use the food that I've gathered from her, but also it fuels my mission, it fuels my work that I do and the purpose that I have. And I think that in the diet and exercise space, and there's a lot of talk about what kinds of foods to eat, and almost nobody talks about how you're getting those foods. And as far as the spiritual gratitude, appreciation part, which many of our ancestors, that was part of how they evolved, that is almost completely gone for the vast majority of people.
Yeah, it's pretty sad. It's pretty sad. I think that act is so valuable and so moving. Like you said, this is a buffalo that you hunted, whose skull is on your fireplace. And at every meal, when you are eating food that you've hunted, you are reminded of the emotions, really of the responsibility that comes with being a human on this planet.
Absolutely. And I think that one of the dangers of plant-based approaches, while I think there's a lot that I can see eye to eye with them on, I think there's a lot of common ground. I think one of the biggest dangers is if it's all in our mind, it becomes very easy to be disconnected from the reality. And what I mean by that is if we've got a plant-based economy in some dystopian future, you've got a lot of fallow fields there's been tons of fawns and mice and other animals that get killed in the process of producing monocrops. And I think a lot of vegans understand this at some intellectual level, but they might not feel it as really what is happening. And I feel a real sadness with birds that I see in my neighborhood where a cat kills this bird. There's just a different type of connection now to death, to animals, and a love for them that I couldn't experience without actually hunting and taking part in that process myself.
Yeah, I think that if we are going to choose to eat meat, we need to know what it is like to take that meat on our own. I think that this is something that every human should experience for themselves. I think this is a fundamental part of being a human that 98% of people never get to explore. And like we've talked about, is quite moving and will change, I think, anyone who does it from a respectful perspective, from a spiritual, respectful perspective. Now, of course, I think that hunting gets a bad name because there's parodies of hunters as, beer drinkers who disrespect the natural world. But I think anyone that approaches the hunting of animals or the harvesting of food with their own hands from a respectful, informed perspective will be moved and changed by that forever. And that's why I think it's so cool that you're doing this and that I'm looking forward to getting back into it. People may know this about me if they've heard me on other podcasts. There was one season when I was in Flagstaff before I went to medical school that I bow hunted for a few weeks in the fall. And I had to think about how to stalk that deer and what I smelled like and what they were looking for and how to be quiet. And that required spending long amounts of time in the wilderness, away from other people, by myself or with my friend, watching animals or watching their patterns or watching how they moved. And when the time came to actually kill an animal, it was not until I had invested many, many hours to getting to know them that was possible. And then when I killed the animal, I saw this beautiful deer, laying there dead at my own hands. And I thought, wow, I didn't think like I'm a horrible person. My first thought was probably similar to what you're describing. It was like, wow, I had better be a good person. Like, this is going to remind me every time I eat this animal, it's going to remind me that life is a cycle and we can't avoid that. And that by living on this earth, I am using resources, and my responsibility is to
take those resources and to do the best that I can with it, to do the most good in the world, whether that's caring for the land, whether that's sharing information that's going to help other people become more healthy, whether that's just making responsible decisions, being kind and compassionate as best I can. It was such a clarifying experience for me. It was really cool.
Totally. I'm glad that you've had that experience, and it kind of reminds me of some of the Native American teachings that I've learned, especially around the bison, because the bison was an animal, especially in the plains, where they oftentimes didn't move much, and it was very easy for the Native Americans to stock up on them and hunt them. And there was this sense, or there was a myth almost, that the bison offered itself to humans, and it was an offering in order for them to live, but also with the understanding that they had a responsibility to their family, to their community. And I feel that way as well. If I had to, in some kind of cosmic way, anyone who has done any kind of serious psychedelic experience might understand where I'm coming from. But if I had to, in some way, communicate with this animal and ask them, I'm on a mission that is going to support you, that's doing what I consider to be good in the world, and asking for that offering, I feel very strongly, like Paul Chek says, eat the animal. The animal is wanting you to do good work, basically.
Yeah. And that's cool. We need to do good work. That's what we're trying to do right here.
Exactly.
And you just got back from something that I think is really cool. You hunted with the Crow Nation, right?
Yeah, I just came back from spending a weekend in Montana, and we hunted the Bighorn Mountains in Montana with the Crow, specifically a few elders and their families that I have relationships with, named Standing Elk and Real Bird, the Real Bird family. And so it was a really great experience where it felt like almost looking back in time, because we were going on this huge expanses where you can see for hundreds of miles almost in the Bighorn Mountains. You can see this flat plains, and we could see with our binoculars these huge herds of free roaming bison, 300, 400 bison, and having these Native American Crow kind of standing on a hill looking with their binoculars, a little bit different than in the past, but it did feel like it was looking back a few hundred years at something that had been happening for thousands of years.
And so what was it like? You went there, you knew these people previously, you went there, and were you guys bow hunting? Were you rifle hunting? How did you stalk the buffalo? Tell us what happened. Like, how was it?
Well, the hunt was incredible for a number of reasons. Some of my expectations and romanticism was dashed in some ways, but I really learned a lot, and it was great to be in that setting. We went into the Bighorn Mountains in a region that is only Crow Native Americans can trespass into that region of the mountains. And so it's very pristine, not really all that developed like some other wildlife refuges and things are, not really altered all that much. And there's free ranging bison, there's also elk, there's also deer, there's bears. So we were kind of in a place where their objective was to hunt the bison, but there was animals everywhere. And so I went stalking with some of the younger group, and they had rifles. They were looking for elk. And so for anyone who's familiar with elk hunting, you do a lot of calling and trying to bring the elk to you. But honestly, we had more sightings of bear than we did elk. And so there was a bunch of black bears, and I personally would eat a black bear, but we never had a good shot on one. But it was the first snow of the season up there. So there was this added cold component. The weather conditions made it really tough. It also really made the whole unit a lot closer together, and I was the only non-family member that was with them. So I really got to be a part of their family. And that was a part that I had not really expected. We couldn't end up getting to the bison because the snow was so heavy and it was just too hard to get there on foot or on it be a vehicle. But we did have an opportunity to shoot a deer, a big mule deer, and the kids had an opportunity to take that shot. And one thing that I found really interesting was, and this is a sad thing about a lot of reservations, there's a lot of poverty there. And there's the juxtaposition where these are people who they still have passed down some of their nose to tail eating traditions, where if they kill a bison, they eat the kidneys raw from the bison and they love it. They eat it from a very young age. The kids love it. But by the same token, in this poverty, and I mean it is pretty abject poverty, they eat a lot of junk foods and they just eat Chex Mix and chips and other things like that. And it's just an interesting juxtaposition, something I have to check myself for judgments because, I live a very privileged life that I've been educated in the ways that we have about diet and things like that. But be that as it may, it's just awesome to see their traditions around hunting and what they leave offerings of the animal when they kill it to the mountain. It's an offering to the mountain, and really it's just a way for them to acknowledge that there's a greater power. And, of course, they leave a choice piece of meat. And that kind of, at first, my fantasy was that Native Americans, they eat everything. They consume every part of the animal, and some tribes do, but there's a lot of different tribes. And the Crow and this family specifically, they leave the heart of the bison on the mountain, and it's an offering to the Great Spirit. And I personally love bison heart, so I always kind of shudder to think about leaving that, but I understand kind of where it's coming from for them, and so it's a tradition that I respect.
You and I ate bison heart when I was in Austin many months ago.
Yeah, you had the last piece of bison heart from Alice, the bison that I killed, and we had a little bit of powdered organ meats on it as well.
Yeah, that stuff was really good. It was like your little powdered organs concoction.
Yeah, some venison liver powder that I like to add to soups and other savory items like you did on the steak.
What's interesting is that I believe it's in The Fat of the Land, might be in Hunters of the Great White North, Bill Lamar Stephenson also relates that in Inuit communities or within Inuit communities, the kidneys are particularly treasured and fed to the young kids as quote unquote candy raw, which is quite interesting. I have recently developed quite an affinity for raw beef kidney. I think it's really enjoyable and it's quite nutritious. People may have heard me talk about this a little bit, but if you look at the vitamin K2 and riboflavin content of kidney, it is very robust. Riboflavin is present in equal quantities as liver, as is vitamin K2 in kidney. So I've started joking with some of my clients that kidney is the new liver. Kidney is really nutritious for humans. And if you can't tolerate liver, or you don't want to eat liver, or you want to just mix it up with your organs, I think kidney and liver would both be at the top of my sort of hierarchy of organ meats. So you guys killed a mule deer and the children took the shot. You didn't get a buffalo, but what else did you observe about how the crow eat the animals? You said they eat nose to tail, but what else? Did you see anything else about how they traditionally eat the animals or how they ate what they'd harvested?
Well, a lot of what I learned about them has kind of come from their teachings and their stories. So, we didn't get a chance to do it ourselves. And if I'm honest, I think that certain things they still discuss and they still feel compelled to aspire to, but they don't necessarily always practice.
Mm.
And they obviously, for the meat itself, they make steaks, they dry it out in jerky form, and they've been doing this for hundreds or thousands of years in order to create food for some of the leaner times in the winters. The kidneys, like you said, are really relished, and it's something that they eat raw, straight out of the animal. And as far as candy for kids, one thing I found interesting was that they tell stories about how children will rush to the killed bison, and they'll actually take the gallbladder and squeeze some of the bile onto the liver and then eat the liver raw. So it's like bile, it's like almost like a lemon squeezing onto some meat, but it's all raw, it's all straight from the animal. So that was a real testament to their stomachs back in the day. And I've learned, aside from that, I haven't really seen them in action, so it's hard to say. But from my experiences with the Comanche, for example, because I live in Texas and I have relationships with the Comanche, I can say that they have a history, very, very similar to the Crow in terms of the way that they would mix. So, for example, if a female bison was giving milk to the young, they would mix the warm blood with the milk and drink that. And they would even, like for a suckling calf, they would use the curdled milk from the stomach, and that was considered a delicacy.
Mm.
So they would, use even pregnant cows and babies had slightly different nutrition that they would take advantage of, obviously, in survival situations. And then one thing I found interesting for snack foods, especially considering today's, consumption of chips and all that kind of stuff, the Comanche warriors would clear the intestines with 2 fingers. So they would just remove the intestines or remove the contents of the intestines and then wrap it around their neck raw. And they would just ride on horseback and eat the intestines whenever they got hungry and they needed a snack. So they would literally have intestine lining hanging around their neck and just eat a snack every now and then of some raw intestines.
And I think that people may be listening to this and kind of making the ooh face, and going, oh, that's gross. But I just hope that the listener can put it all in context. And this concept has come up before. I think that though these concepts may seem radical, it is only radical in today's society. And what we are doing today is an incredibly profound departure from the ways of the past. So one of the things that I find so intriguing about the carnivore movement or animal-based nutrition, the Paleolithic movement, the ancestral movement, is that it challenges us to think about the context and where we sit within the general sort of timeline of events. And I just want people to realize, and the listener to think about the fact that the way we are living now is very different than the way that we have lived for the majority of our evolution of humans. And though many of these concepts may sound stomach curdling or very queasy inducing or very different than what we're used to, that is only because we have not done this for the last few hundred years, but our ancestors were doing it a short number of generations ago, and it provided pretty simple, comprehensive nutrition for them.
Totally. Not only did it provide comprehensive nutrition, but if you look into the way that the Comanche specifically lived, it was to some degree kind of a brutal existence in the sense that warfare was a major part, and rape and all these kinds of things. But at the time, the Comanche were probably the freest people on the planet. I mean, beyond maybe other hunter-gatherers, but the Comanche they were eating all of these foods, but they were all delicacies for them. They enjoyed it, like you said. They had a bounty for many decades as far as how many bison were on the southern plains. And for them, they were nomadic, so they could roam from here to there. They didn't have any specific place they had to remain. They were relatively egalitarian. They had lots of time to enjoy their leisure. Males especially had multiple wives sometimes and things like that. So yeah, what they maybe traded off in their not having sugar and all of the trappings of civilization that was already existing in the Anglo-American world, they had a level of freedom that came with their dietary choices and needs that I think a lot of us would actually feel very compelled towards. So yeah, as far as trying to eat those foods now, I think that taking baby steps is probably the best thing for anybody to do. And I'm sure many people who are listening to you have already started that journey because, dude, I was raised vegetarian and I slowly ventured into meat, and then I ventured into red meat, and then I ventured into hunting my own meat. And now I'm like all the way to eating the organs straight from the dead animals that I kill. And so that was like a multi-year process, but it's totally possible for people to kind of adjust their palate. And there's some unbelievable chefs that do work with game meat. And I mean, like Jesse Griffiths, who's just a local Austin guy, he has a book called A Field. And then Stephen Ranella has a few books about large game animals. And there's some fantastic recipes in there that I've served for a lot of my friends where I'm almost tricking. It's like kind of a grab bag. They come and they get like a liver mousse. They don't expect that it's liver that's in this mousse. And same with egg roe. So I do a lot of fishing, and here in Texas, crappie and bass are the big fish to catch. And for some reason, every fisherman almost throws out all the eggs when they catch the fish. And so I'm going fishing with people who have fished for 20 years, and I'm telling them, give me all the eggs and save all the eggs for me for the entire season, because I'll just eat that roe. And I mean, it's incredibly nutritious. It's delicious when you know how to cook it. And it just takes a little bit of time and getting used to, I think.
Most of the roe that I've had has been just cured. It's just been in salt. How do you cook fish roe?
Well, this might be outside the bounds of your carnivorous lifestyle.
Okay.
But I'll cook. What I do is I basically cook it in a lot of butter and garlic. That's essentially the trick, and it is basically when you cook it with a lot of butter and with some garlic. You don't cook it very much because otherwise the roe can get kind of gritty. But cooked that way, it's basically like just creamy. The texture is just like it's pure fat. And I'm talking specifically about crappie and bass eggs, which are not like salmon eggs or typical caviar. They are more like egg sacs. They're about that big, and they're sacks of eggs. And you just take them straight out of the fish and cook the whole sack together.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. Okay. And then what do you have planned for the fall? Are you going to do some bow hunting yourself?
Yeah, I'll be in a couple days. Actually, I'll be hunting in the Texas Hill Country for some whitetail deer. I'm looking to keep the freezers stocked with food, and then I'm headed to British Columbia in a few weeks actually to hunt for some moose, some deer, whichever we can kind of come across. And then I'm really excited at the end of this month, I'll be going to Louisiana, and we'll be hunting wild hogs and deer and squirrel. Squirrel is one of those small game that I haven't tried, and I'm really interested to get that into my diet. And then we're going to do a couple days of deep sea fishing and onshore fishing to kind of get the fish part of my diet set up for the rest of the year. So as you can tell, fall is a big season for me. I'm kind of like I don't know if you know, the founder of Patagonia, Yvon Chouinard, is this multi-billionaire, and yet he takes many months of the year off to go fly fishing. And I kind of take a lot of time off in the fall to do my hunting and fishing as well.
But you're not yet a multi-billionaire, though we all hope that we can become that.
Yes. But the reason I bring that up is because he is my sole person that I can point towards where I can say, hey, I don't have to change my lifestyle and I can still achieve doing great things.
Now, isn't that a cool concept that we could stay true to our values and yet achieve great things? Because one of the things that I have experienced recently with personal growth, business growth, has been a real demand on my time. And I have to stay pretty disciplined to keep surfing in the equation and stay working out. There's a real temptation there to not do those or to let work get in, overcome that. But that's a cool model to think. Hopefully we could all find those things that we are passionate about, and in the midst of doing the most good that we can in the world, still do those things and not forget about those things.
Totally. I think that as granular as we want to be in terms of diet, and that's definitely important for people who have, clinical issues that are being addressed at some level. I think that the other components of an ancestral life are oftentimes neglected. It's real easy to say, get enough sunlight, spend time outside, but how many people take those things as seriously as the food that they eat? Because our ancestors lived in that environment. Our ancestors were not lathering themselves up with sunscreen, spending most of the time indoors, and then getting shocked by a sunburn when they finally step out into the sun. So we have to really look at all components. And that's been a journey for me. I'm by no means perfect. I'm still, like you said, I still have to be disciplined about how I approach these things. And hunting is a way that I can stay disciplined because it puts food on the table. So it makes even more sense than spending time on my computer to make money to put food on the table. And that's one of the reasons why I love hunting. It just kind of like short circuits the whole rat race that we're in, because it's like, I got to provide. Let me just provide by doing it.
That's the way it used to happen, man. And that's what I was talking about at the beginning of the podcast, that we're being asked to trade, instead of getting out into wilderness and doing the things that we have been doing throughout our evolution, hunting and getting our food, we're exchanging our jobs for money to buy food. And a lot of people work jobs they really like or find meaningful, and that's great. I'm thankfully in that camp, and I'm very grateful and fortunate to be there. But a lot of people work jobs they don't enjoy, and they're spending time kind of punching the clock in order to get money to get food. And in some ways, there's a real beautiful elegance to just short-circuiting that is going to getting food by yourself. I mean, if you can get all of your own food, that really changes the whole perspective on life. If you had all of your food given to you and it could somehow have a shelter, like what most of your needs are taken care of.
Yeah, you don't need a lot. And there's a lot of hunters that I admire that are kind of going that route where they spend a lot more of their time outdoors, and maybe some of the time when they're outdoors, they're not shooting a gun, but they're using a camera. So they're doing photography and they make a little bit of money on their photography. And it's not a way that I fully understand how to live yet, but it's a way that I've seen others make work. And at the very least, it's worth taking lessons and notes from them. And, I think that's one of the reasons why we always meet at Barton Springs Pool, because it's just it's an opportunity to you don't have to get all the way out of the city, so to speak, to enjoy some nature.
You got to get some wilderness, though. I think I need some wilderness. That was one of my concerns moving to San Diego, but thankfully, the ocean is a wilderness outlet for me. And I think we all humans need wilderness. So that's something to think about. Now, one of the things that may come as a surprise to the listeners of this podcast is, let's talk a little bit about psychedelics. It's not something I've ever talked about on this podcast. And as a physician, it's a controversial topic, though within the field of psychiatry, there's lots of good research that psilocybin, the molecule derived from a mushroom, is very efficacious for. It's been studied in cancer patients in terms of their anxiety and end-of-life grief. There's been a number of randomized controlled trials with psilocybin done both in the Northeast at Johns Hopkins and other universities, I believe NYU. So psychedelics are beginning to gain acceptance. MDMA is being studied in the VA system for PTSD. You mentioned ayahuasca at the beginning of this podcast, which is a DMT type of psychedelic. But, I'll see how people react to throwing in a little discussion of psychedelics here. And, if people, the only thing I'll say at the beginning is, if people are not familiar with the concept of psychedelics or this rubs them the wrong way, I'm open to feedback. Basically, I just think it's an important thing for us to know about. And if people don't have interest in this, that's fine. I respect that. But let's talk a little bit about your experiences with psychedelics. And maybe, you mentioned in the beginning, so it's clearly tied to this whole equation.
Totally. Yeah. And I've done numerous different types of psychedelics, and I've done them sometimes more recreationally and most times more kind of ceremonially. And ayahuasca has definitely been among the most profound experiences for me and in multiple ways. And, for anybody who has doubts about it, but has an interest in an ancestral perspective, ayahuasca has been used in South America for at least 3,000 to 5,000 years. There's evidence that it's been used that long. Psilocybin mushrooms, even longer than that. So we have pretty clear evidence that these compounds have been used longer than most of the systems we have in our current food system, whether they be, meats prepackaged on the shelves or processed foods and things like that. So that's just some ancestral context as far as psychedelics are concerned. But I'm an open book as far as how my experiences have gone.
So I have never talked about this on a podcast, but I have done psychedelics once. So I had this grand curiosity about psychedelics for many, many years. And then within the last year of my life, finally had the opportunity to do psilocybin containing mushrooms. And for me personally, this was a profound experience. But, as a physician, that's a fairly controversial thing to admit, considering that these are illegal, And so hopefully none of the listeners of this podcast will turn me in, nor do I think that it's actually a real risk of that. But for me, it was a profoundly moving experience. And when I did it, I did not do it in a recreational perspective. And I personally have never wanted to do psychedelics. I have not done psychedelics since that time. And I have never wanted to do psychedelics outside of the natural world. But I went to a lake in the mountains outside of Seattle, and I spent an afternoon there by myself. And for me, it was a profound, profound experience where I felt so connected to the natural world around me. And I don't even know how to explain it, but I just felt like I could talk to plants. And of course, there's chemicals in my brain, so who knows? But I felt a kinship with plants, and I felt so at home in the natural world, more at home than I've ever felt there in my whole life. Like it was clear, like there was no more fundamental feeling for me than being in the natural world. I did not want to leave. In fact, I had a friend come with me just to kind of steward me, and he was off, like a quarter mile away, so I couldn't see him. But in case something happened, I wanted to have somebody there because I didn't know what was going to happen if I did these psychedelics. Was I going to freak out? And instead, I just felt so at home that I did not want to leave. I said, just go back to Seattle and then I'll come back. I'll find my way back somehow, or have somebody come back later. I'm not ready to leave. I did not want to leave the natural world. So my limited experience of psilocybin-containing mushrooms has been that that I felt a kinship and a belonging in the natural world deeper than I've ever felt before. And the cool thing was that I remembered that. I never forgot that. And sometimes I'll see plants and remember, when I did that, there was almost like a door that had opened and it's shut now. It's not the same. I can't relate to plants in the same way. I don't know if I'll do it in the future. If I do it in the future, I would only do it in the context of preparation and intention. I see those types of things as quite sacramental, but I'm curious what your experiences with psychedelics have been, and how that led you to think this way about hunting and interaction with the natural world.
Yeah. Well, I have definitely gotten the most from psychedelics when I've done them in a really strong container, in the sense that it's guided in some way. There's a real strong intention behind it. And I got really lucky in some senses. One of my spiritual teachers says that the plants chose me in a way, that I did ayahuasca right before my first hunting experience and right after my first hunting experience. It wasn't on purpose. It just kind of coincided this way. And the reason he says the plants chose me is because it forced a very, very strong message for me. And my line of thinking was, beforehand, I read this book, The Body Keeps the Score. I don't know if you've read it.
Sure. By Bessel van der Kolk. Sure.
Yeah. And so it talks about how the body stores trauma. And it's not just necessarily a mental thing. There's actually trauma that can be released in the body. That's why you see all these Eastern practices like acupuncture, et cetera, et cetera. And what came to me when I was having that ayahuasca experience was that if the trauma that I experience is stored in my body, the trauma that an animal experiences is stored in their body. And this might not be something that I can articulate clearly in a scientific way, and it might not even be something that can be articulated by science at all right now. But that was the hypothesis that I had, and from that place, I realized that if there's trauma in this animal, and this animal literally becomes a part of me, I eat it, my body breaks down the constituent amino acids, puts it back into different places in my body, then that trauma is literally becoming a part of my body. And I don't want anything to do with that anymore. And that's where I made those commitments that I wasn't going to partake in eating meats that, weren't killed in an ethical way. The animals didn't have the life that I wanted for them.
This is a great argument for sort of regenerative agriculture, regenerative farming, grass-fed, grass-finished animals. One of the things that I am so excited about with White Oak Pastures, who people will know as a sponsor of the podcast, is the way that they treat their animals. We're going to be there in December 14th and 15th. I'm having a sort of like celebration of regenerative agriculture at White Oak. But White Oak is just an example of a farm that's doing this as the best we can within a farming environment, giving an animal a wild life. They only have one bad day, and you know what? We all have one bad day where we die. So, and even if maybe that's not even a bad day from the spiritual perspective, it's just, I think that I believe very strongly in regenerative agriculture, regenerative farming, and I believe very strongly in grass-fed animals, grass-finished animals. And I think that most people appreciate that grass-fed animals are different than grain-fed animals or grain-finished animals. People will certainly know that even grain-fed animals spend 85% of their life on the pasture, but the last 15% of their life before they are killed, they're probably going through some traumatic things. And like you're saying, there's a question of whether we want to support that and whether that some of that can be internalized into what we are as humans. And look, I think that people should do what they can in terms of affording meat, but I think that investing in good quality meat is a fantastic investment. And it's pretty hard for me to get super excited about recommending grain-fed animals to people or traumatized animals. I would much rather them be in a very evolutionarily consistent environment for the majority of their life, And I encourage everyone to check it out. I'll post more in the future about this thing happening at White Oak, which we're going to call White Oakchella. You should come, Mansal. And it's going to be awesome. And people can see what it's like to how these animals are raised. And if people can't come to that, I would encourage them to visit the farms near them and see how the animals are raised and see what it's like. Obviously, I think hunting animals that are wild is probably the best thing. We probably can't all do that all the time. And the next best thing would be eating animals from places like White Oak, or there are many farms like this now in the US that I think we need to support. And the quality of the land is important and how they're raised. We had talked about that a little bit before the podcast with this idea of microRNA, and decided that neither of us really knew enough about it to talk about it intelligently. But microRNAs are these sort of antisense RNA fragments that can bind to our RNA and essentially affect the way that RNA is transcribed, that RNA is translated, and how genes get expressed, and it affects our epigenetics. And so the theory there, the hypothesis, is that perhaps some of the trauma is internalized through things like microRNA in the epigenetics, and we'll leave it at that so that neither of us looks too silly talking about things that we haven't fully researched. But microRNA is a real thing.
Totally, yeah. And also, I don't always know how much of these practices are going to be researched, because you have to consider how much money it takes to do this research, who benefits, where's the funding come from. And, I spent 6 years in the supplement world, and I can tell you right now, there's a lot of ancestral practices that will never be studied because there's no money to do it. And so I love science. I'm more of an enthusiast than an expert, and I also realize there's limitations. So when I see limitations, I often veer towards an ancestral template for guiding my philosophy.
I think that's pretty wise. And I think that most people would agree that the quality of the food we eat is important. And where that food comes from is a huge part of the quality of that food.
Totally. Yeah. And imagine what it does for your own sense of well-being and gratitude. Even there's plenty of positive psychology that shows how our thoughts influence our physiology. And I think that having a certain relationship, even if it's not hunting, even if it's just a relationship with the landowner of a regenerative farm at a farmer's market that's nearby, that can do wonders for your sense of fulfillment when you're eating. And I believe that has a big impact on the way that your body, utilizes that food.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So one of the coolest things about this conversation is that you have offered this opportunity for people to come hunt with us. So that in January, which weekend is it?
10th through the 12th.
10th through the 12th of January in Austin. I am going to be in Austin hunting with Mansal, and we are inviting people to come do this with us. There's a limited number of spots, so people will need to sign up, and give a deposit probably shortly after this podcast comes out if they want to do this. But I'm excited to go hunting with you and to share this experience with people who are similar minded. So tell us about what's going to happen on our hunt. I mean, I'm going to bring a bow, and we're going to hunt, and it's going to be really cool.
Yeah, well, we're going to hunt in the Texas Hill Country. And for those who aren't aware, the Texas Hill Country is a very special part of Texas. Texas, the whole state is very ecologically diverse. And the Hill Country, very mountainous, or hilly rather. And there's white-tailed deer, there's tons of hogs. So we're going to be hunting both the native white-tailed deer and the invasive wild hogs. And there's going to be kind of a mix of experiences from ambush hunting, waiting for these animals to come through certain choke points and trying to ambush them there, and then also going and doing spot and stalk. So I'll be, leading. I'll have guides that are, very, very well versed in the hunting side of things that'll be there to help out. And I'm just excited to share hunting as a practice with as many people as possible. And, most people are going to start with a rifle, as we've, talked about. That's really great because they have an opportunity to take a life. They have a better opportunity to take a life. And I think there is something really special about that process, no matter how it's done, whether it's a rifle or bow or whatever, because it can be kind of romantic to think about going straight to archery, but it's a challenge for a lot of people, and you might not get it on the first try. And so what I really like about the hunting in Texas is that it really offers people that chance to go from never having killed a life to having that experience, and it can be profound for a lot of people. So we're going to do that on a Friday, Saturday, Sunday, and it's going to be an incredible experience for just the fact that it's a cohesive group with you.
Yeah, it's going to be a little tribal. I'm pretty excited about it. What a cool opportunity for people to come together with others who are similarly minded about doing this respectfully, with intention. We will certainly be eating these animals nose to tail. No one should doubt that. And anyone that decides to come on this trip will likely eat a raw kidney beside me. But I think it'll be a really cool thing. And it sounds like we're going to be camping and campfires and kind of stalking, and just, it's going to be, I think, hopefully as much of an ancestral perspective and ancestral experience as we can create in a hunting environment.
Totally, yeah. It'll be as much of an ancestral experience, like you said, and with the added focus of having these people walk away with meat that can remind them of this experience, to have them walk away with, considerable amount of meat. A lot of people in previous retreats have gone back 30, 40 pounds of meat. And there's just something obviously to that cohesive tribe nature during the event itself, but also going back to your day-to-day life and bringing that experience and that connection into your day-to-day life. I'm not always perfect about it, but when I stop and really think about the meat that I'm eating, the meal that I'm having, and I can think back on that moment, it takes me from a kind of frenetic, chaotic place where I'm working on my business to more relaxed and connected. And I definitely see the value for people in being able to do that.
Within meditation, which is something that I value but continue to struggle with, there often is this bell. I've done some mindfulness meditation in the past, and sometimes in mindfulness meditation, there will be a bell, a reminder, come back to the breath, come back to the mindfulness of where you are. And how cool is it to be able to have every time you eat be a bell, be a reminder of where you've been, be a reminder of your place in the world. And I think that something like this, hunting in general, the gathering of meat in an intentional way, the provision of food in an intentional way, can be that sort of a bell for people, just to remind you, like, hey, you're a human on a planet, and your ancestors hunted this meat forever, and now you go to a grocery store and there's no bell. You don't remember where we are. But ultimately, we have a relationship with the earth and the environment and sort of this space-time continuum, this universe we're in. It sounds very metaphysical, but we're part of something bigger. And for me personally, it's quite clarifying to remember that. And it's easy to forget that in the hustle of my day-to-day life. Seeing the stars, being in the wilderness, hunting, or even just having a bell, a reminder at every meal that I'm part of something bigger, I think is a really cool thing. And maybe the more of those that we have in our daily life, the better off we'll be. This podcast is way different than other ones I've done. It's getting all like metaphysical and shit.
That's awesome, man. Yeah, I'm not a scientist. We're not going to go down that rabbit hole necessarily.
I know, it's different.
To be able to go into the other realms.
Yeah. So let's wrap up. Tell me a little bit about your perspective on the current food system, where it's going? Yeah. What is happening right now?
Well, I think that your listeners are going to be way more savvy than most people that I speak to about this. But there's just something about the way the food system works that it's incredibly disconnecting. It thrives on disconnection. Imagine you walk into a grocery store, and many of your listeners won't have to worry about this, but the average person walks in and sees tons of packages, and all these packages are trying to tell them a story. They're basically lying to them about the health benefits, how the workers or animals are treated, how the plant's treated. And so you have all these, lying products in the grocery store. Sometimes it's because they just outright lie. Sometimes it's because they say, oh, we're organic, but our workers are mistreated. And in the context of meat, it's like, we're natural, but what the fuck does natural mean anymore? And then we're grass-fed, but we grain finish. And so as consumers, we're playing this game with producers and manufacturers. We're playing this game where we're trying to figure out what the heck they're doing. They're trying to hide things so they can make money. And it's not a system that's conducive to A, consumers feeling good, and B, us preserving our home, Earth, which is in a pretty devastated shape and currently getting worse and worse. And so the model that I have, myself and my business partner, Tim, have created, it's a company called Candor. And I'll just briefly explain. We have these ideals around the way that we want food and products to be created. And these are ideals that come from our heart. And they're not heady, they're from our heart. We want animals to be treated humanely and all these different things. And then we admit and acknowledge the flaws of our products. And we tell people so that they are on the same team as us. These are the flaws in our products. And sometimes that's because we can't do any better. The system is set up in a way where we can't, find out more. We can't investigate further. Or in the case of meat, maybe it's set up in a way where, we can't use wild game to create products because it's illegal to do that. So we acknowledge those things. And then we dedicate 90% of our profits to fixing those flaws. And so that's kind of the model that we've designed and we hope to start a movement with. But the more important thing is just to realize collectively as a society that food companies are oftentimes lying to us. The whole food system is set up so that they lie to us. And we also have a responsibility as individuals to make sure that we want to see what is sometimes uncomfortable. And I think sometimes, and that is often the key, because it's real easy to blame the companies, but it's important for us to be willing to see the truth about the animals in some of these factory farms and things like that, because it's a two-way street. If the companies are hiding it, it's because we don't want to see it in some sense. So anyway, I'll get off my soapbox, but that's kind of some of the fundamental problems that I see with the food system.
I like that you said that it's a story, and I think that it is. I think a lot of these food companies are trying to tell us a story, and humans are narrative creatures. We want to be told a story. We've liked stories since we were little kids. But the problem is that most of the stories that we're told are false. They're just fairy tales. They're fables. And in fact, they're more sinister than that. They're misleading sort of Pied Piper tales. They're not even happy fairy tales. They're misleading tales that are not good for us and that really only seek to benefit the manufacturers of these foods. And the more people look into this, they can refer back to the episode I did with Gary Fettke about the nutritional guidelines, and the episode I did with Peter Ballerstedt, where we talked about the actual environmental impact of ruminant agriculture, which is nothing like it's made out to be. You noted that the earth is in dire straits, and every time you turn your head, there's another Hollywood star saying, eat less meat, which is completely incorrect in terms of factual impact of ruminant agriculture on the face of this planet. Now,
eat better meat.
Eat better meat. eat meat, eat better meat. And, even grain-fed meat is not a big contributor to greenhouse gases. We just need to realize as humans that the real story is that technology, electricity, and all of the things that we treasure are the major contributors to greenhouse gases. And ruminant agriculture is one way to start reversing that in farms like White Oak, which can sequester carbon in the soil. That's a whole different story.
Sure.
But it's not about eating meat. It's about the car we're driving, the technology we're using. I mean, you and I are using technology right now to do this podcast to spread the message. In some ways, it's difficult to escape this, but that's where we need to focus. And people are putting that focus onto animals incorrectly. But I would urge the listener to think about the story they're being told when they go into the grocery store. And then think about the lack of a story when they buy that meat. And then I'm going to shout against Whole Foods right here, because if you go into Whole Foods, they have a lot of meat that says pasture raised, which is not grass finished. It's like that is conventionally raised meat that is grass fed and grain finished. And they are selling it in a misleading way for people. So hopefully people that hear this will realize that Whole Foods is doing kind of a sneaky thing there. And I've had multiple people myself, I've even fallen prey to this, but it's like you're saying, grocery stores, manufacturers, they're trying to tell us a story, and most of the time these stories are misleading, but there's really no more true story than just getting food yourself and being part of the natural environment while you're doing it. So that's a pretty cool thing.
Yeah, that's exactly why these hunting experiences are part of my business, is because, we can partner with these farms and we can have our own farm and do these, regenerative agriculture concepts. But at the end of the day, just take people out and educate them. It goes back to that adage, teach a man to fish. He won't be hungry the rest of his life.
Yeah. So where can people find more about this hunt and more about you, my friend?
Well, they can just, visit Instagram.com/Mansal Denton if they want.
Or just at Instagram, Mansal Denton.
Yeah, I'm very familiar with it.
MANSALDENTON. I'll link to it in the show notes.
Yeah, and they can, reach out there, note any of the micro concepts that I'm sharing on Instagram. And then, of course, the website is choosecandor.com. And there is a very specific link for the partnered retreat that you and I are doing, which you can add to the show notes as well.
And there is a link to this retreat in my bio on Instagram as well. Go to my link tree. There's a link there. Candor is spelled CANDOR. So choose Candor, CANDOR. And I should mention to people that I am not making any money on this retreat. This is not for my profit. It's just something cool that I want to do with Mansal, that I want to share with people in the community. I don't benefit from this. This is Mansal's business. It supports him, as we all should. And it's just an opportunity to come and hang out with me, if you guys want to, in the wilderness and do some hunting. So that is that about the retreat. Yeah. Great. Well, yeah. What were you going to say?
Well, yeah. I mean, honestly, I don't even make any money on this either. This is such a passion project to be able to bring people the similar experience that I had. And I just love partnering with people like you, so that it's bring your community, and we'll get it all set up and do it, and we can see all these smiling faces over the course of the weekend. So yeah, that URL for people who are just listening is choosecandor, CANDOR.com/Paul-Saladino-Apex-retreat.
Oh, that's a horrible URL. Yeah. Why don't we just change it to CarnivoreMD?
Yes, there's going to be a redirect. ChooseCandor.com/CarnivoreMD. Yes,
that's what we'll do. CarnivoreMD. There's links everywhere. There's links on my bio, Mansal's bio. I've posted about it on my Instagram. If people want to come on this retreat, they'll find it. And if they go to just choosecandor.com, they can find a link to it as well. So that'll be cool. So, for those people who are listening, who this resonates with, I would love to share this community time with you. Come on this hunt with us. I think that this is a cool opportunity to create community of people who are interested in this stuff. So I hope that people will find this valuable. Thanks for your time, my friend. The last question that I always ask everyone on the podcast, you're probably going to have a good answer to this. what is the most radical thing that you have done in the last month?
Ooh, man. It has definitely, well, I have a little bit of a recency bias, but I brought that heart from the mule-deer home with me. I didn't need to check it in, so I put some I put some snow from the mountain into a bag with my heart, and I had that as my carry-on luggage as I flew back to Austin, Texas.
That is amazing. What did this? How come we didn't lead with that? Why did we not lead with that in the podcast? Like, what did the stewardesses think of that? What did your person sitting next to you think of that?
They all just laughed and asked me about it, and even TSA was like, "Well, this is a first."
But it's totally legit, huh?
Yeah, it's fine. They just had to make sure like what it is, and I brought it back. It was totally chilled the whole time. I mean, it's a beautiful thing to be in Montana in the mountains hunting, to take that snow from the high altitude, put it together with the heart of an animal I took part in killing, and then be back home in Austin grilling it up within 24 hours.
That's pretty amazing. I imagine it was pretty good.
It was delicious.
That's awesome. We should have led the podcast with that. But anyway, that's a good way to end it. Thanks for coming on, my friend.
That's the ruthless retention gimmick.
We'll see. I hope people listen this far, and I appreciate you coming on.
You too, buddy. Thanks for having me.